By the spring of 1645, Charles I has one serious army left. This requires a moment of accounting, because the language of armies in the Civil War is loose enough to obscure the actual situation. There are still royalist forces in the west, Goring's cavalry in Somerset, Hopton's infantry in Cornwall, scattered garrisons holding castles and manor houses across Wales, and the marches with the stubborn immobility of men who have nowhere better to be. There are still individual commanders of ability and occasional local success. The war, technically, continues on multiple fronts, with multiple forces wearing the king's colours and invoking the king's authority. But there is only one army that constitutes a genuine field force capable of meeting Parliament in open battle and winning, capable of the kind of decisive engagement that could, even now, shift the war's momentum enough to force the negotiated settlement that is the best realistic outcome Charles can contemplate. It is the army he has assembled through the winter of 1644 and 1645 from the survivors of Marston Moor, reinforced by cavalry from the west and infantry levies from the Midlands, stiffened by Rupert's reorganising energy and whatever remained of the Royalist officer corps after 2 years of attrition. It numbers perhaps 9,000 men at full muster, smaller than Parliament's new model army, less well supplied, less consistently paid, but commanded by officers of experience and led, in its cavalry, by Rupert, with the brilliance that has never been in question and the strategic patience that has always been. Charles commands it personally, which is both its greatest symbolic asset and one of its persistent practical liabilities. The king's presence gives the army a legitimacy and a morale that no professional commander can replicate. Men fight differently when the thing they are fighting for is physically present on a horse 50 yards behind the line, visible and mortal, and apparently unafraid. But the king's presence also means that every significant decision passes through a council of war in which political considerations, court factions, and the management of royal dignity compete with military necessity for priority. Rupert wants to move fast and strike hard. The council wants to be certain. Charles wants to be right. These are not always compatible requirements. Through April and May, the army moves through the Midlands with the purposeful energy of a force that knows it must force a decisive engagement before the new model army, still consolidating under Fairfax, still integrating its new command structure, becomes the instrument it is clearly being built to be. Rupert argues consistently for the offensive. The council debates, the army marches, counter-marches, takes Leicester in a violent assault on 31st May that produces more plunder than strategic advantage, and finds itself in the rolling Northamptonshire countryside in early June, with Fairfax's new model army somewhere to the south, and the intelligence picture insufficiently clear for anyone's comfort. On the night of 13th June, Royalist cavalry scouts report that the new model army is closer than expected, closer, in fact, than comfortable. Fairfax having moved north with a speed that the Royalist command has underestimated. Rupert rides out, personally in the dark, to assess the ground. He finds a low ridge near the village of Naseby that offers reasonable defensive terrain, the kind of position from which a smaller army can receive a larger one's attack with something approaching equality of terms. He recommends fighting here. The council debates through the night and into the morning. By the time the decision is made, the morning is half gone, and Fairfax has had several additional hours to deploy exactly as he wishes. The pattern, for those keeping score, is familiar. Chapter 2. The field, the deployment, the familiar mistake. The ground at Naseby is not as flat as Marston Moor, but it is open enough. The ridge Rupert has identified runs roughly east to west, offering the Royalist army the high ground and, crucially, a position from which the parliamentary deployment in the valley below is clearly visible. Fairfax's new model army numbers approximately 14,000 men, outnumbering the Royalists by roughly 5 to 4, a margin significant enough to matter without being so overwhelming as to make the result inevitable before a shot is fired. The deployments mirror each other with the symmetrical logic that 17th century military doctrine prescribes: cavalry on both flanks, infantry in the centre, artillery positioned along the front. On the Royalist right, Rupert commands the cavalry, his own regiment and several others, the best horse Charles has. On the Royalist left, Sir Marmaduke Langdale commands the Northern Horse, veterans of the Marston Moor disaster who have been rebuilt over the winter into something functional if not entirely restored. In the centre, the Royalist foot, perhaps 4,000 infantry, faces the new model's infantry across a shallow valley. Opposite Rupert, on the parliamentary left, Ireton's cavalry, younger and less experienced than Rupert's veterans, commanding the flank that Rupert will be attacking. Ireton is a lawyer-turned-soldier, methodical and brave, not yet the figure of Cromwellian inner circle he will become, still learning the trade, in the way that the war has been teaching men the trade since 1642, by doing it under fire and surviving long enough to extract the lesson. Opposite Langdale on the parliamentary right, Cromwell, 55 years old, Lieutenant General of Horse, the man who turned his cavalry at Marston Moor in the dark and rode them back into the battle while everyone else was pursuing fugitives across the Yorkshire moors. He surveys Langdale's position across the valley with the professional attention of a man who has been doing this for 3 years and has by now a fairly precise understanding of what Royalist cavalry does and how to answer it. The battle begins at around 10 o'clock on the morning of June 14th, 1645. Rupert charges on the right. The charge is everything Rupert's charges always are: fast, violent, committed, the product of a commander who believes in the decisive cavalry attack with the totality of a man for whom it has always worked. Ireton's cavalry, receiving the charge on difficult ground with less experience than the force hitting them, breaks. Not immediately, not without a fight. Ireton himself charges forward in a counter-move that takes him into the Royalist infantry line, where he is wounded and captured, briefly, before the chaos of the engagement returns him to his own side. But the parliamentary left gives way. Rupert's cavalry is through and beyond the line. Rupert pursues. He pursues past the parliamentary infantry, past the artillery, past the baggage train. His cavalry, 2,000 horse, the best the king has, rides on toward Nalseby village, where the parliamentary baggage is parked and where there is, briefly and pointlessly, a small engagement with the baggage guard before the futility of the enterprise becomes apparent, even to the most committed pursuer. He attempts to rally his troopers and return to the battle. He is gone for the better part of an hour. On the parliamentary right, Cromwell advances against Langdale's Northern Horse. Langdale's men fight with the resolution of veterans who have learned from Marston Moor what happens when cavalry breaks, and the engagement is harder and longer than the one on the opposite flank. But Cromwell has more men, better rested horses, and the incalculable advantage of fighting with a disciplined system against cavalry that, however brave individually, cannot match the collective organization of the Ironsides. Langdale's cavalry breaks. Some flee north, some are cut down on the ridge. Cromwell turns his cavalry, for the second time in less than a year, on a different field, in different weather, against a different configuration of the same enemy. Oliver Cromwell does the thing that Rupert cannot do and has never done and will never do. He stops his cavalry at the moment of their victory, turns them, and rides them back toward the centre of the battle where the real work is waiting. This channel exists because history deserves to be told as it actually was, not simplified, not sanitized, but whole. If you've been with us a while, you know what that means, and if you're new here, this is a good day to start. Chapter 3. The centre, the break, the capture. In the centre, the infantry engagement has been going badly for Parliament. The Royalist foot, 4,000 men, the hardened core of Charles's remaining infantry, has pushed forward with a discipline and aggression that surprises the new model's infantry and very nearly breaks them. The parliamentary centre gives ground. Colours are taken. Men fall back in the disorganised way that infantry falls back when the push of pike goes wrong and the man next to you is no longer there, and the enemy is pressing forward with a momentum that feels, in the moment, unstoppable. Fairfax is personally in the centre, his helmet gone at some point in the fighting, his head bare, riding up and down the struggling line with the deliberate calm of a general who understands that what his infantry needs right now is visible proof that the situation is not as bad as it feels. He rallies men individually. He fills gaps in the line with his own body, which is the kind of leadership that produces legends and occasionally produces dead generals. He is not killed. The line holds, barely, in the grinding way that infantry lines hold when they have nowhere better to be. Then Cromwell arrives in the Royalist infantry's flank. The effect is not instantaneous. Nothing in a 17th century infantry engagement is instantaneous, but it is decisive. The Royalist foot, already extended by its own aggressive advance, already separated from the cavalry support that has ridden off in two different directions, suddenly finds itself pressed from the front by Fairfax's rallied infantry and struck from the right by Cromwell's cavalry. The cohesion goes, not everywhere at once. Some regiments stand and fight in the way that good infantry stands and fights, selling their ground at the price their training has prepared them to pay. But the overall formation disintegrates, the rout spreading regiment by regiment in the way that battlefield collapse always spreads, through example and panic and the fundamental human instinct that says the thing to do when your formation is breaking is to move away from the breaking rather than toward it. 5,000 prisoners are taken before the day is done. The new model army's cavalry pursues the fugitives 12 miles north, gathering prisoners with the efficient thoroughness of an army that has been told explicitly and repeatedly that prisoners are a resource and broken men who are allowed to regroup are a liability. The king's artillery is taken, all of it. Every gun, every limber, every barrel of powder that the Royalist train has carried through the spring campaign. The king's baggage is taken, every tent, every supply wagon, every piece of administrative equipment that a field headquarters accumulates over months of campaigning. And the king's correspondence is taken. This is where the battle ends and the catastrophe begins. Chapter 4. The Cabinet opened. The cabinet, the leather-bound chest containing Charles I's personal correspondence, is found in his captured carriage in the baggage park north of Naseby by parliamentary soldiers who recognise immediately that they have found something considerably more significant than plate or linen. It is opened. The letters are read. The letters are sent to London. Parliament publishes them in August 1645 under the title The King's Cabinet Opened, a pamphlet that sells with the urgency of something that confirms what people have suspected and provides the documentary evidence they have not previously had. The letters are genuine. This is important because Parliament's opponents will claim for years that they are forged or selectively presented, and the claim will be made often enough and loudly enough to create some lasting uncertainty. But the letters are genuine, and their content is, by any reasonable assessment, damaging enough to require no embellishment. What the letters reveal, specifically and in Charles's own hand and in the hands of his correspondents, is the complete picture of his diplomatic strategy since at least 1643. The strategy he has been pursuing simultaneously with every parliamentary negotiation, behind every concession, beneath every appearance of good faith engagement with his opponent's constitutional demands. He has been negotiating with the Irish Confederate Catholics for military support, specifically for an army of Irish Catholic troops to be landed in England and used against his Protestant Parliament. This negotiation, which Charles has conducted with genuine pragmatism and without apparent concern for the political consequences of its exposure, is the single most damaging revelation in the cabinet. England in 1645 fears Irish Catholicism with a depth and consistency that cuts across every other political division. The memory of the 1641 Irish Rebellion, in which Protestant settlers were killed in numbers that English propaganda has inflated far beyond the actual casualties, but which were genuine and terrible regardless, is 3 years fresh. The idea that the king has been attempting to bring an Irish Catholic army onto English soil is not merely politically damaging. It is, to a substantial portion of his remaining supporters, morally disqualifying. He has been writing to Henrietta Maria in France, asking her to solicit military support from Catholic European powers, France, Spain, the papacy itself. The letters are detailed, specific, and operational rather than merely rhetorical. He is not expressing a general desire for foreign assistance. He is asking for particular things: troops, money, weapons, and offering particular concessions in return, including concessions on English Catholicism that he has simultaneously denied any intention of making in negotiations with parliamentary commissioners. He has been writing to his commanders with instructions that directly contradict the positions he has been maintaining in negotiation. He has told parliamentary negotiators that he intends no military solution while writing to Rupert about the strategic necessity of decisive engagement. He has professed commitment to the Church of England while offering its modification in correspondence with Catholic intermediaries. None of this is, in isolation, unparalleled in the diplomatic history of 17th century Europe. Every monarch of the period maintains multiple negotiating tracks simultaneously, offers different things to different audiences, and regards correspondence as a tactical instrument rather than a binding commitment. Charles is not, by the standards of his peers, unusually duplicitous in his methods. He is, however, unusually exposed. This is what history actually is, not the clean story in the textbooks, but the cabinet that falls open in the baggage park and shows you everything at once. If that matters to you, you know where the subscribe button is, and if you don't subscribe yet, no pressure. The history will be here, either way. Chapter 5. The reading of the letters Wanda receives the King's Cabinet opened in the second week of August, 1645, 8 weeks after Naseby. The timing is not accidental. Parliament has taken the interval to verify the letter's authenticity, to select the most damaging passages for presentation, and to arrange the publication in a form that maximizes both public impact and political utility. The pamphlet is cheap. This is deliberate. Priced at a penny, it circulates through the city with the speed that cheap print always achieves in a literate population hungry for confirmation of its existing anxieties. It reaches the coffee houses and the market stalls and the chapels and the legal inns simultaneously. Read aloud in some places to those who cannot read for themselves, passed hand to hand in others with the urgency of a document whose importance is self-evident. The response is not uniform. Nothing in England in 1645 is uniform, the country having divided itself so thoroughly over the preceding 3 years that almost any significant event produces simultaneously a parliamentary interpretation, a royalist interpretation, a Presbyterian interpretation, a sectarian interpretation, and several regional variations on each. The King's Cabinet opened is no different. Royalist pamphleteers respond within weeks, questioning the letter's authenticity, challenging the interpretation of specific passages, arguing that the King's Irish negotiations were defensive rather than offensive, that the correspondence with foreign powers is routine diplomatic activity misrepresented by a parliamentary regime desperate to justify its rebellion. But the Presbyterian middle ground, the substantial body of parliamentary opinion that has supported the war as a constitutional rather than revolutionary enterprise, that has never wanted to depose the king but only to bind him within constitutional limits, that has been arguing throughout the war that a negotiated settlement must eventually be reached, and that Charles, properly constrained, can be trusted to observe it. This group reads the Cabinet's letters with a particular quality of attention. They have been making the argument for negotiation. They have been making the argument that Charles is a man of his word, who has made errors of judgment, but is capable of genuine settlement. They have been making this argument against Cromwell's increasingly explicit scepticism and Pym's carefully documented distrust, and they have been making it, at least in part, because they lacked the documentary evidence to definitively prove them wrong. The Cabinet has now provided the documentary evidence. The argument for negotiation does not immediately collapse. The human capacity for maintaining useful beliefs against contrary evidence is considerable, and many men in the parliamentary coalition will continue to negotiate with Charles for another 2 years, through the propositions of Newcastle and the Isle of Wight negotiations and the vote of no addresses, each negotiation producing the same result for the same reasons. But the argument loses a dimension of sincerity after August 1645, the men making it know now in a way that cannot be unknowed what the man they are negotiating with writes to his wife about the negotiations. He writes that he intends to give Parliament the appearance of concessions without their substance, to use negotiation as a breathing space in which to rebuild his military position, to accept whatever terms are necessary in the short term, while working toward the reversal of all of them when the balance of force shifts. He writes this clearly. He writes it repeatedly. He writes it to Henrietta Maria, who saves the letters which are then captured at Naseby, which are then published by Parliament, which are then read by every lawyer and merchant and Presbyterian minister in London who has been arguing against the evidence that the king can be trusted. He cannot be trusted. The letters say so in his own hand, without ambiguity. Chapter 6. Oxford. The Diminishing Court. Charles receives news of the pamphlet's publication in Oxford with the particular quality of response that characterizes his worst moments. He disputes the letter's interpretation, challenges specific attributions, and then continues doing exactly what the letters describe. He is not unintelligent about his situation. His private correspondence in the months after Nazebi shows a man who understands the strategic position clearly, who knows that the military campaign is over in any sense that matters, who has begun to think about the endgame, about which of his opponents might be separated from the others, about whether a Scottish alliance might be reconstructed, about whether the parliamentary coalition's internal divisions might be exploited into something useful. He thinks carefully. He writes carefully. He continues to negotiate on multiple tracks simultaneously, offering different things to different parties with the same systematic flexibility that the cabinet has just exposed to public view. The difference is that everyone knows he is doing it now. Fairfax's army closes around Oxford through the autumn and winter of 1645, the royalist garrison shrinking as outlying positions fall and the supply lines tighten and the arithmetic of a besieged city becomes inescapable. The court continues its routines. The presence chamber, the chapel services, the council meetings, the correspondence, with the determined persistence of an institution maintaining its forms past the point where the forms have any content. Courtiers who have been in Oxford since 1642 begin, quietly and without announcement, to discover reasons to be elsewhere. In April 1646, Charles leaves Oxford in disguise, dressed as a servant, his beard trimmed differently, travelling with 2 companions when rides north. He is heading for the Scottish army at Newark, having concluded after months of calculation that the Scots represent his best remaining option. A force outside parliamentary control, with their own agenda, with whom he has been negotiating through the winter in the hope of constructing something that might yet be leveraged into a settlement on terms he can live with. He rides out of Oxford in the April darkness through the city's north gate, past the colleges and the meadows and the river, past the apparatus of the court he is leaving behind, the maps, the secretaries, the correspondence he has been conducting from this room for 4 years, and into a countryside that is, in April, green and ordinary and entirely indifferent to the figure moving through it at a careful walk. He is never free again. The Scots deliver him to Parliament in January 1647 in exchange for the payment of their arrears, the transaction reported in contemporary accounts with the kind of deadpan brevity that suggests even the reporters find it too dispiriting to elaborate. The king, sold by his Scottish allies for the cost of an army's back wages, delivered to the Parliament he has been trying to outmanoeuvre for 5 years. The cabinet at Naseby has done this as much as any battle. It has removed the last layer of diplomatic ambiguity, the last argument for charitable interpretation, the last basis on which a man of goodwill could maintain that Charles I might, under the right circumstances, be negotiated with in good faith. It has shown, in the king's own words, what the king actually intends. And what the king actually intends is the reversal of every constraint his opponents have spent 5 years trying to place upon him. The parliamentary commissioners who negotiate with him on the Isle of Wight in 1647 and 1648 know this. They negotiate anyway, because the alternative, trying and executing a king, is more terrifying than negotiating with one they do not trust. But they negotiate differently. They negotiate the way you negotiate with a man whose correspondence you have read, whose methods you understand, whose good faith you cannot pretend to assume. They negotiate to create a record Rather than reach a settlement, they negotiate to demonstrate, for the benefit of posterity and the army, and the increasingly radical opinion that Cromwell is managing with decreasing ease, that negotiation has been tried and has failed. It has failed. The cabinet at Naseby has ensured that everyone knows why. Chapter 7. What the letters cost. The letters cost Charles I the war twice. First at Naseby, where the army that carried them was destroyed, 9,000 men. The last full royalist field force, broken in an hour on a Northamptonshire ridge by an army built on the precise principles the royalist command has never been able to adopt consistently: discipline over brilliance, return over pursuit, the institutional over the individual. Then in London, in August 1645, where the publication of the cabinet's contents destroyed something more durable than an army, the residual persuasive force of the argument that Charles could be trusted. Armies can be rebuilt, as Rupert has demonstrated twice. Trust, once documentary evidence has removed its last rational foundation, cannot be rebuilt by assertion. Cromwell reads the letters and is not surprised. He has been arguing for 3 years that negotiation with Charles is a process without a destination, that the king's concessions are tactical, his agreements temporary, his commitments conditional on circumstances that he is simultaneously working to reverse. The cabinet confirms this position with the authority of primary evidence, and Cromwell files the confirmation with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose assessment of the situation has just been proved accurate in the most public manner imaginable. Charles reads the pamphlet in Oxford and writes to Henrietta Maria that Parliament has misrepresented his intentions. He is probably sincere. He is also demonstrably wrong in the specific way that a man is wrong when his own words, reproduced accurately, mean exactly what they appear to mean, and no charitable interpretation changes the fact. The war ends in 1646. The negotiations extend for 2 more years. The same arguments made by the same men in different locations, Newcastle, Hampton Court, Carisbrooke, Newport, until the army's patience is exhausted and the Second Civil War, brief and brutal, removes the last argument for continuing to negotiate and makes the trial that everyone has been not thinking about inevitable. Naseby is the battle that broke the king's army. The cabinet is the document that broke the king. The scaffold is what happens when you have broken both and spent 2 more years demonstrating that the breakage is not recoverable, and left behind an army of convinced men who have read the correspondence and drawn the obvious conclusion and are no longer willing to be managed by the argument that the situation is more complicated than it appears. The situation is not complicated. The letters say so, in the king's own hand, filed in a leather cabinet, captured in a baggage park on a June morning, while Rupert was still 3 miles away in the wrong direction, riding toward a parliamentary baggage train that was never going to win the war even if he reached it, which he did, which did not. The cabinet opened. England read what was inside. The rest followed as the rest always follows. Not with dramatic suddenness, not with clean narrative satisfaction, but slowly and then completely, in the grinding, irrevocable way that consequences follow causes when the causes have been accumulating long enough and the evidence has finally run out of places to hide.